Hi, I'm Eric Avedissian, and I have a story that appears in this anthology, Across the Universe, Tales of Alternative Beatles. And I'd like to read it to you right now. It's called Liverpool Band Battle 1982. How did the Beatles become the biggest new wave sensation of the 1980s? How did I end up snogging Annie Lennox in the loo at the Ritz? How did we hit our stride in our 40s, unknown and untested? It all began in 82, when a drug dealer beat the shit out of me. John Lennon interview, Rolling Stone, October 1987. John's head pitched back as the brute's fist connected with his jaw. "Hello, Nigel," John said, and spat blood onto the sidewalk in a frothy blob. "Evening, Mr. Lennon," the rough man who restrained John said. A gold chain hung around his beefy neck, and a black leisure suit obscured his sinewy body. "Seems we got ourselves a little impasse with the transaction, so I'm going to tell you how this works. See, I provide you with the cannabis, and you pay me for it. Easy peasy. Now, where's my bloody money?" "About that," John said through the pain, "I'm only a humble handyman. However, I'll be getting work soon, and can pay you in about a fortnight." Nigel frowned. "That is most disappointing, Mr. Lennon. I thought we established a rapport, everything all business-like. Now Dex here will punch you again." Dex struck John's nose, sending his glasses skittering across the sidewalk. "A fortnight, or else Dex make sure you ain't got no hands. Can't be a handyman without hands, eh, my son?" Nigel rasped. They left John crumpled in the gutter, body bruised and nerves jangled. He heaved himself up and stumbled toward the nearest pub. John shook sleep from his eyes, yawned, and greeted the day in agony. A faint gardenia scent assaulted his nose. The woman in bed next to him resembled a bog hag, a scrawny waitress he had seduced after a few pints. Head foggy, John reached for a cigarette on the nightstand, placed it between his lips, cracked the lighter, and inhaled. Nicotine. Hangover. Strange woman. Must be Saturday, John thought. He climbed out of bed with a grunt, donned his dressing gown, and shooed the woman from the house. "By the way, you was terrible," she laughed on her way out. "My showerhead is more responsive." Life didn't turn out the way John had planned. As a rebellious youth, he had loved music. His band, the Beatles, played a wild mix of rhythm and blues and rock and roll. All five of them, John, Paul, George, Stuart, and Pete, dreamt of stardom, of inebriated nights surrounded by girls, money, and groveling sycophants from the music press. Then they had pissed it all away. The young, idealistic, and rebellious young man transformed into a 42-year-old recalcitrant grouch who chain-smoked Dunhills, drank lager, and voted for Margaret Thatcher. The world had gone mad. Rock music became relegated to a few innovators like the Rolling Stones, the Animals, the Dave Clark Five. If the Beatles had stuck together, John surmised they'd at least be as successful as Herman's Hermits. These old rockers yielded to disco's rhinestone-studded jumpsuits and punk's angry anarchist rhetoric. Then new wave hit the airwaves, and every kid wanted an electric keyboard instead of a guitar. John read the Liverpool Echo and ate beans on toast while Aunt Mimi sipped her tea and stared out the window. Aunt Mimi had been his guardian ever since that drunken policeman had killed his mother. Her hair done up in rollers, she resembled one of those pepper pots from Monty Python's Flying Circus, like Mrs. Premise and Mrs. Conclusion, except instead of Grand Chapman and drag, it was Aunt Mimi, face drawn and sad. "It might rain today, John love," she murmured. "Yes, well, sometimes it does that," John replied. The doorbell rang. John threw the paper down and marched across the linoleum kitchen floor and down the hall. He opened the door to find his ex-wife and son. Cynthia, blonde, blue-eyed, petite, forced a smile. Julian, a wiry and sullen teenager, wrapped his jean jacket around him and looked down at his Doc Martens. "You're behind in your child maintenance payment," Cynthia announced. "As a non-resident parent, you owe me £50 each week. You missed 2 weeks, so you owe me 100. John wrinkled his nose. "Always scrounging for cash, aren't you?" Julian is continuing his education. He's a talented musician. Cynthia put her arms around her son, who shrugged her off. Is that right? Just like his old man, John beamed. No, John, Cynthia said abruptly. He's nothing like you. I pray he never will be. What's that supposed to mean? Cynthia leaned so close, John could see the flecks of mascara on her eyelashes. It means you're a vile, abusive man. You wallow in your misery. You barely spend time with him. He's not doing me any favors, John said. Cynthia closed her eyes and inhaled. She'd done that several times over the years when they fought. I need 100 pounds or I'm calling the police. John trudged into his room, cobbled together 50 pounds, and returned downstairs. It's all I got, you hideous succubus, he said. Cynthia took the money and stuffed it in her purse. Bring the rest when you can. Is there anything else you want? John asked. A set of pewter candlesticks, the complete works of Charles Dickens, a sample of my plasma. You're an asshole, John Lennon, Cynthia snapped. I haven't heard that before. After Cynthia and Julian departed, John went upstairs to his bedroom, took out his Gibson acoustic guitar, sat on the edge of his bed, and strummed. Beautiful melodies wafted from the guitar and filled his room. Bitter tears fell from his cheeks. He brushed them away and noticed a scrap of paper on the nightstand. It was a flyer for a band competition. He must have picked it up in the pub the night before. Liverpool's Pub Band Battle 1982, calling all amateur musical groups to a pub band battle. 1st of June, 1982, at the Cavern Club, 10 Matthew Street, Liverpool. Winner receives £500 and exclusive play at Liverpool's pubs. John realized this opportunity was only 2 weeks away, a musical showcase that would bring together Liverpool's most talented rock bands. With that money, he could pay off Nigel and show Cynthia he wasn't a deadbeat father. John played a few happy notes and realized he'd need more. A sad, middle-aged man strumming a guitar alone on stage like a dour folk singer wouldn't impress anyone. He needed something more. He'd need the Beatles. I could have spent my autumn years watching Benny Hill on the telly or feeding ducks in the park. Instead, I'm wearing makeup and playing guitar for pissed college students. What a world, eh? John Lennon interview. Hit Parader, February 1985. John entered Paul McCartney's fish and chip shop in Toxteth, pushed himself past the lunch crowd, and sat at the counter. He whiffed fried cod and boiled potatoes, a sharp nostril-curling stench that made his mouth water and retch simultaneously. Paul, with a round belly, short hair, and stained apron, served a steak and kidney pie to a hollow-eyed man reading a newspaper. He saw John, and a bemused smile crept upon his face. Lo and behold, the prodigal son returns, Paul said. I've been meaning to pop round and have lunch, John said. What do you want? Sorry? To eat, Paul said. Eels and mash are nice. That's debatable. Oh, fancy a salad? Tofu? Crudité? Paul snickered. We only serve real food here, mate, not that hippie vegetarian garbage. Give me the cheapest thing, John requested. Always a man of impeccable taste, Paul said, went to the kitchen, and returned with a plate of jellied eels and mashed potatoes. He set it in front of John, who poked the grey, congealed eels with a fork. Ugh, John grumbled. Looks like a bloody autopsy. Well, you don't want it then. I didn't say that. John ate the rubbery eels, dipping them in the potatoes. He removed the flyer from his pocket and slapped it on the counter. John told Paul that this was a rare opportunity for the Beatles to make a comeback. They could be the best pub band in Liverpool. Paul balked. Do you realize we were shit together? Paul said. They even called us the Failed Five, I know. But I've got a feeling. Maybe we were meant for greater things, John said. Playing the Cavern Club, winning some pub band contest. You daft? We pick up where we left off. What if the Beatles return and get the respect we deserve? You know what this is, mate? You're trying to prove something to yourself. You're a 40-something addled old bloke, Paul said. We were good, we just weren't focused. Maybe the timing was off, or the chemistry, but we could have made it, John said. Playing for screaming drunks in pubs is the answer? Paul asked. I bet George and the others will be interested, John insisted. Have you heard music today? It's rubbish. It's all disco and synthesizers and stolen rhythms, John said. If you hadn't gotten us kicked out of Germany, who knows where we would have been? Paul blinked. Excuse me? I got us kicked out? You and Pete lit the condom on fire. The club owner had you arrested and deported back here, John said. You performed in your underpants, with a toilet seat around your head, you cheeky bastard, Paul said. John smiled, recalling that night. They were fun times. Then things fell apart. Stuart took up with that German bird, Astrid. We came home and performed at the cabin club, but everything seemed off. I know what happened in Hamburg, John. I was there, Paul said. Sleeping next to the Lou, the Indra, Kaiserkeller, top 10 club. Getting into trouble wherever we went. Face it, John, we weren't musicians. We were hooligans with instruments. Bad blood flowed between them. Years washed some of the blood away, but it remained, deeply stained in Paul's refusal. Paul couldn't participate until the other members also agreed. John would convince them the only way he knew. He'd lie. The disheveled Harrison and Sons electrician's van was parked outside George Harrison's flat in Wavetree. George got out of the van with a boy of 18, each clad in coveralls embossed with a lightning bolt. Slim and lean, George boasted a mustache, salt and pepper hair, and groomed sideburns. The boy resembled George's younger doppelganger, or as John remembered his friend from the old days. George reached into his pocket, pulled out a wrinkled 10-pound note, and handed it to the boy. He told his son to get them food from a local takeaway. What do you fancy, Pop? The boy asked. Vindaloo and chicken curry? George wrinkled his nose. Ooh, Indian food, can't stomach it. Get us some pork pies and a packet of crisps. After the boy left, John pounced. Hiya, George, John said. George blinked. Lennon? Remember the Beatles? Hamburg? The Cavern Club? John pulled a leaflet from his pocket and showed George. How about we reform the Beatles and enter this band battle? I know we can win. £500 plus guaranteed performances at pubs throughout the city. Paid gigs, every one. George thrust the leaflet toward his friend. Pass. What do you mean, pass? Look at me, John. I'm an electrician. I have a family. I'm putting food on the table. I can't muck about with a rock band. George explained that Paul was interested in reuniting the Beatles, a lie that intrigued George. McCartney? He's doing this? George asked. Yeah, I spoke to him. Says he's excited to reform the Beatles. He's looking forward to seeing you on stage with him. George scratched his chin. John knew George mulled the thing over carefully. By the time his son returned with lunch, he made his decision. He was in. Stuart Sutcliffe's art studio in Rope Walks smelled of sandalwood incense and turpentine. A framed photo of Stuart with Andy Warhol hung beneath one of Stuart's paintings, a drab gray and white rendering of some forgotten cathedral. John hadn't seen Stuart in years, and the once skinny boy with a shock of hair and sunglasses had become a skinny man with bald spots and bifocals. Stuart was dressed in a black turtleneck and tweed jacket and appeared interested in John's presence. Stuart's wife Astrid prepared tea while their daughter Melody watched television. MTV played the Rolling Stones video Start Me Up while Mick Jagger danced, John's heart filled with disgust. That could have been us up there, not them, John folded his arms. Come off it, John. He's just a singer in a rock band. It's not like the Queen's gonna nat him or anything, Stuart said in a Scottish brogue. The Rolling Stones, the most influential band in British popular music. Top of the Pops called those wankers geniuses. That skinny fella shaking his ass like he was on fire. A genius? Please. You're a music critic now. Impressive, Stuart said. John showed Stuart the flyer. I'd like to reform the Beatles and enter this contest. Stuart laughed. John, I'm no musician. I'm bloody awful. You're the coolest bass guitar player I know. Besides Paul, that is. If Paul's interested, use him, Stuart said. I'm content with my art. John bit his lip. Look, Stuart, I know this sounds barking mad. Why go back to performing music at our age? Except if we don't, we'll miss the last opportunity for the Beatles. We didn't make it in 61. Hell, that fight we got into there where I saved your life drove you away from the band. John reminded Stuart of the time when some thugs attacked him after a show. Stuart was under assault, and John and Pete rushed to his defense, pummeled the boys, and rescued Stuart. I'm grateful, John, and you said if there was anything you could do for me, don't hesitate, John said. Remember? Stewart exhaled, as if he recalled the exact conversation vividly. Right, so? We reform the Beatles just for one night. We play a few songs in the Cavern Club. We win this contest. I'm a wee rusty on bass. We'll practice. Pete's mother's place. Casbah Coffee Club, John said. It's familiar, it's private. Let me get this straight. You want us, a group of 40-something men, to rehearse our band in our friend's mother's basement so we can enter some barmy band contest? Stewart asked. When you put it that way, it sounds like we're pathetic teenagers, John said. Aren't we? Stewart said. Why do you want to win this thing? John sighed. He couldn't bottle it up any longer. He might have lied to Paul and George, but Stu was one of his oldest friends. My life since the breakup is one long disappointment. Music wakes me up, makes me feel alive. Remember playing those gigs in Hamburg? The screaming crowds, the girls, the booze? It was all one big party. I wish we could recapture that sensation just one more time. Stewart shrugged. We can't, it's gone. But it needn't be, John said. Both Paul and George are aboard. If I can get you, then Pete will follow. Dust off your bass, and let's do it once again. Once more onto the breach. We weren't the same band after 20 years. Hell, we weren't the same people after 20 years. Time does weird things. Hardens hearts. Breaks your resolve. Makes you cloyingly sentimental. Only thing I knew is we had to play our music. George Harrison interview, Tiger Beat, March 1986. Pete Best, thrilled at John's offer, scheduled their rehearsals at his mother's nightclub 2 days later. John spent that time sulking around the house and performing random handyman tasks. When he wasn't fixing a hole in the roof, or filling in cracks in a door, or painting a room, he thought about the band. He rang Cynthia, went to her flat, and gave her £50 he made doing handiwork. When she asked him why he gave her the money so promptly, he replied that he wanted to do the right thing. He found Julian in his room, Depeche Mode blasting from the speakers. John shut off the record player. Listen, lad, I'm reforming my old group, the Beatles, John said. I'd like it if you attended. John gave Julian the leaflet. The boy brushed his long hair from his eyes and stared at the paper. Is this a joke? Julian asked. You never play music. Not on stage, no. I play guitar in my room at Aunt Mimi's, John said. Julian scrunched up his nose like someone had emitted the most rancid fart in Great Britain. It's less than 2 weeks. You're reforming the band in less than 2 weeks before you perform? Well, practice, John said. The thing is, I've been a real gobshite. You deserve better than me for a father. Julian crumpled the leaflet in his hand. Stop. You apologized to me just so I'd go to your stupid band battle. Nobody wants to see a bunch of relics bopping on stage. New wave, post-punk. That's what's hot. John pleaded with Julian, but his son shrugged him away. When John's begging didn't work, he slammed the bedroom door and marched out of the house, muttering something about raising a feckless tearaway. Rehearsal day arrived. John mounted his bicycle and made the arduous trip to West Derby. Guitar case slung to his back. Lost memories returned as John headed toward the familiar Victorian house. Inside the Casbah Coffee Club, a small stage area spread out beyond a low stone archway. Pete Best's drum kit was on the stage, near a hodgepodge of speakers and sound equipment. Been a long time, hasn't it? Pete asked. He had a mustache, shoulder-length hair and tan skin. Too long, my friend, John said. John strapped his guitar, a Rickenbacker 325 with a shiny maple glow finish around his shoulders. George had his Gretsch country gent guitar, while Paul and Stewart each had a long-necked Hofner 500 bass. At long last, the Beatles played. They were horrible. Stewart had trouble following along with the others, his fingers botching chords and lagging on the tempo. Pete flubbed the percussion, missing beats and not keeping pace with John, Paul, and George. These mistakes wore thin on John, who ranted like a crazed banshee. As the days passed, things grew worse. Stewart was an empty husk with his bass. This ain't working, Stewart groaned. It's not syncing up for me. I'm all thumbs. Stewart, if you're not perfect on every single note, then we'll lose the contest, and things will be really bad for me, John said. Very bad. Stewart removed his bass from his strap and placed it in his case. "Forget it, mate. What the hell was I thinking? It's all shit." "You're afraid. You always were," John said. "Come off it, John." Paul placed a reassuring hand on his friend's shoulder. John swatted him away. "No, Paul. Stu pulled the same shit on us when he stayed in Hamburg. He had to go to art school and shack up with that German bird," John said. "He's no musician." Stewart gripped his case. "You're right, John. I'm no rocker. But I lived my life with my family, making the art I wanted to. I didn't abandon my wife and child and lock my dreams away for 20 years like some people." John responded with an unbridled torrent of profanity that continued long after Stewart had left the club. The awkwardness dragged on for a week, with the band performing their original composition. John belted out lyrics and played rhythm guitar while George played harmony. The result blended familiar pop rock with a grungy mod sound. They argued over Stewart's absence and John's determination. Calm down, John." Pete stretched his arms. "This is supposed to be fun." John kicked the amp. "Fun? The Beatles could have been huge. Something was off, but now we can play again. We can show the world what they've been missing all these years." "Blimey, it's just a sodding pub band battle, not a night at Albert Hall," George said. John kicked the amp again and bombarded his bandmates with insults, calling them soft and musically impotent. Pete ejected John from the club, which brought Paul and George into the fray. When Pete slammed the door, John heard that deafening chord in his head, echoing hours later when he tossed and turned in bed. It looked doubtful the Beatles would perform. Excerpt from Liverpool Band Battle 1982. Will the Beatles finally get back together? Will they win the band contest? Will Julian finally respect his father? And will John pay off Nigel? All of these burning questions can be answered in Across the Universe.